Hey there, and welcome into another episode of the Route 1 Rundown. I'm your host, Steve Gorgie, and I'm thrilled to be back for another episode to talk some Terps. But first, a reminder, this show is part of the Department of Hoops, a DMV media network. So if you're listening to this show and you want to be watching it, you got to make sure to check us out on YouTube. That's youtube.com/@Department of Hoops. We have this show. There's great Wizards coverage. If you love DMV basketball, then Department of Hoops is the place for you. So make sure you check that out. Hit that subscribe button. Check out all of the great shows on the network. And this is my first time back in a couple weeks, so happy holidays. I hope everybody had a great holidays. Happy New Year. I think we're still within the range of time you're allowed to say that. We're within a week. Yeah, you can say that. So I hope you had a great New Year, and I hope your New Year is off to a better start than the Terps, because Maryland goes out on a Pacific Northwest swing, and they go 0-2 in 2 games in conference against Washington and Oregon. And this is a new thing in the Big Ten. Of course, these West Coast teams joining this year, and Maryland and Illinois got a chance to kind of do the inaugural, the first Pacific Northwest swing. Maryland goes up to Washington, then plays Oregon. Illinois goes up to Oregon and then plays Washington. And this is a new thing in the Big Ten, and something I do think is going to be a pretty big challenge and something that teams have to get used to. It's not normal to fly 6 hours across the country to play a conference game. And I know Maryland went out there a little bit earlier ahead of the Washington game. It seemed like they had some time to get acclimated. But nevertheless, the Terps go 0-2 to start off this new year. And I'm really going to focus in on the Oregon game today, since that was Sunday. I feel like the moment has kind of passed for Washington. I do want to mention it very briefly, though. The Terps fall 75-69, and I thought it was their worst offensive performance of the season. It felt like they just could never really get into an offensive rhythm. Derek Queen got in some early foul trouble in that game, picking up 2 fouls in the first roughly 8 minutes or so of that ball game, and he only finishes with 4 points for the ball game. That was a tough one for Derek Queen. I thought that was one of the first games where you felt like he really looked like a freshman. And then Jacoby Gillespie, he had one of his more challenging games as well. He finishes with just a solitary point in that ball game. He fouls out, and it was just a game where I felt like Maryland never found their rhythm. But it was disappointing. It's a Washington team that you really wanted to go out there and beat, because they have not had a great season thus far. They even lost to Seattle, the Seattle Redhawks, a program that really hasn't been known for much of anything since the late 50s when Elgin Baylor was there. It's not the kind of team you want to lose to, either Seattle or Washington. Washington loses to Seattle. They didn't want to do that. Maryland loses to Washington. The Terps didn't want to do that either. So it was a disappointing game, but I kind of understood it. It's this whole new thing in the Big Ten. You're going way out to the Pacific Northwest. It can be challenging. The environment wasn't great. You had to bring your own juice, something I thought they did really well against Syracuse. I talked about that a lot after that game. And it was a tough spot. Maryland falls. Disappointing, but you kind of get it just because of the spot. A great team certainly goes out and wins that game, but Maryland is trying to become a great team. They're certainly not there yet. I think that's very clear after this weekend and this West Coast swing. So you come off that game and you go into a game against Oregon on a Sunday afternoon, and you really want to see a good effort. Oregon, let's just be clear, Oregon, a really good team. Oregon's a team that's beaten Texas A&M this season. Texas A&M looks like a team that could be a Final Four contender. They're 12-2. They're number 12 in KenPom right now. Alabama is another team Oregon beat out of the SEC. Alabama went to a Final Four last year. Alabama, one of the favorites to win the SEC, to return to the Final Four. Alabama, number 9 in KenPom right now. So Oregon has beat some really good teams this season, but they get drilled at home. They give up 109 to Illinois, and they lose 109-77 last Thursday. So Maryland needs a big effort going into that Oregon game. Oregon really kind of needs a big effort coming off a terrible home loss. You get drilled like that at home, I certainly am not going to use the word must win, and we're going to talk about must wins a little bit later and whether the UCLA game is a must win or not. We'll get to that in a moment here. So I don't think it was a must win for Oregon, but it's a game for Oregon coming off that thrashing at the hands of the Illini, where they really want to play well, where they are extraordinarily motivated to play well. So Maryland needs a big effort. They're going into another tough spot against Oregon, and they don't quite get the job done. Maryland falls short in that one, 83-79. And I kind of want to do this the good, the bad, the ugly style a little bit, because I do want to start with some good. I was very impressed with the way Maryland came out in that game. After that poor offensive performance against Illinois, or against Washington, rather, Maryland came out hot to start that Oregon game. They looked really good offensively. They looked like they were in rhythm. Rodney Rice looked really good early. He made some outside shots. I was just impressed with the way Maryland's offense rebounded. And even when they got down, at times in that game, they were down, and they fought their way back, and they felt like they were just, the word I keep using is, they felt like they were in rhythm for a large part of that Oregon game. Derek Queen, a great bounce back. After having probably his worst offensive performance of the season, he bounces back with 17 points against Oregon, and he looked very comfortable throughout the course of that game. Rodney Rice, he puts up 19, 3 of 5 from beyond the arc, and honestly, he's a guy that he got to the line 6 times in that game. He's a guy that I would have liked to have seen a little higher usage out of him. He ended up taking 8 shots in that game. Selton Miguel took 7 shots in that game. And it's not a knock on Selton Miguel, but the way Rodney Rice was playing, I think he probably needed to be taking at least more than just 1 shot more than Selton Miguel in that game. Jacoby Gillespie, he had a better offensive game, certainly. He was held to 1 point against Washington, and we're going to get to some of the lapses at the end of this game. I would say, if I was giving him a grade in this game, it wouldn't be an A. It would probably be closer to like a C+, B- type of grade. But it was a better performance than against Washington. They shot really well from the outside. They go 9 of 21 from deep. That's over 42%. And that's hard to ask for much more of that on the road. So I was really impressed with Maryland's offensive performance. Now, as we move into the bad here, one of the things I will start with is it seems like it's become difficult for Maryland to get Derek Queen and Julian Reese going on the same night. Against Washington, Julian Reese was very good, especially in that first half. He ends with 22 points on the night and picked up a lot of the slack for Queen offensively. Now, against Oregon, Reese didn't have quite that game. 6 points to Queen's 17. It feels increasingly hard to get both of those guys going at the same time for some reason. And I do feel like it's great that they're able to kind of ham and egg it, play off one another. When one guy's up, when one guy's down, the other guy can pick him up and vice versa. I think that's great. But for this team to reach its full potential, I think they need to be able to find a way to both be on, to both get going at the exact same time. And that's something that was definitely lacking over the course of this West Coast swing. That's something that I want to see them figure out over the course of the rest of the season. Now, the other thing that I think of when I think of the bad in this game, it's that it's really something that we've seen across all of Maryland's losses, or at least 3 of the 4 losses that Maryland's taken so far this year. Maryland is a team that is known for forcing turnovers. Maryland ranks 27th in the country in defensive turnover percentage. On the year, on average, on the whole year, they force a turnover on just under 22% of possessions. So they force a lot of turnovers. But in some of these bigger games, in the loss to Marquette, in the loss to Purdue, in the loss to Oregon, that's not happening. Against Marquette, they forced us 8 turnovers, 11.8% turnover percentage. Against Purdue, 8 turnovers, 11.4%. Against Oregon, 9 turnovers, 13.6%. That's well below their average. And it feels like when Maryland's not forcing turnovers, they're having trouble getting stops. And that's something, if Maryland wants to be an elite defensive team, that I think is holding them back. And they're going to have to figure out. There's one of 2 things you can do, right? You can either say, okay, this is our flaw, this is who we are, we need to really commit to make sure that we are forcing turnovers, even if we're going to give up some easier buckets, or we need to get better when we have to play out an entire shot clock, when we have to hold the team down for 30 seconds. We can't get a deflection. We can't get a steal. We can't get the ball. We need to play defense for 30 seconds and get a rebound. And we saw a little bit of lack of rebounding at the end of that game at times. But that's something that's sticking out to me in some of these losses. It's, look, Maryland on the year, they're overwhelming the teams like Manhattan, like Canisius, even teams like Syracuse and Ohio State at times. They're able to overwhelm those teams. They're able to force turnovers. But in these losses, the turnovers haven't come. And then when they haven't forced those turnovers, the defense hasn't quite been able to get those stops. Against Marquette, Marquette put up 1.15 points per possession. Against Purdue, they put up 1.19 points per possession. And against Oregon, Oregon was able to put up 1.26 points per possession. Now, I just want to contrast that to Maryland held Ohio State to 0.8 points per possession. And that was probably Maryland's best game of the season. So that was a game, that was their best game of the season. Against Syracuse, one of the other really good performances of this season, the Terps hold Syracuse to 0.81 points per possession. So when Maryland is not getting turnovers, it feels like they're struggling to get stops. And that's something that needs to be figured out from here on out. And what I am trying to understand, what I'm a little bit struggling to understand is, why is that the case? Because there's this line of thinking, and it was discussed at a pretty good amount before the season, that, okay, Maryland is now playing these two bigs, Derek Queen and Julian Reese, are going to be on the court a lot together, and that might make them a little bit less effective defensively, because in this modern day and age of college basketball, it's all about being switchable in the pick and roll. It's all about being versatile. It's all about having a big that could potentially guard a guard when that pick and roll happens. And what I'm not seeing when I watch this team, I'm not seeing a lot of instances where a more athletic guy is getting matched up on Julian Reese or Derek Queen and really creating a lot of problems. What I'm more seeing is I'm seeing miscommunications at times. I'm seeing, especially in this Oregon game, a little bit of, and this is still kind of a miscommunication, some issues in the transition defense. One example, and Maryland started off that second half against Oregon very poorly. I don't have any numbers in front of me here, but look, at halftime, Maryland was up by 3. It was 45-42. By the time there was 16:01 left in the second half and Maryland had taken a timeout, they were down 56-47. It was a 14-2 run by the Oregon Ducks to start that half. And in that run, there was one play where Nate Biddle, Oregon's big, hits a 3 in transition, and Maryland looked like they had it covered pretty well. Julian Reese got back. He was the guy who's on Biddle, but he kind of collapsed to the lane and left Biddle, a guy who hadn't shot the ball extraordinarily well so far this season, but has certainly shown the ability to shoot from the outside and absolutely did it against Maryland, hitting 2 big threes in that game. He kind of leaves Biddle all alone. To me, that's not a matter of Julian Reese isn't athletic enough. It seems more of a matter of a mental lapse. There are some other instances that I felt like were more communication based. So it feels like that's something Maryland can figure out. I don't think that Maryland is at a disadvantage, certainly not in the Big Ten, when Derek Queen and Julian Reese are both on the court at the same time defensively. I mean, both those guys to me seem like plus defenders. Even Queen as a freshman, which is something freshmen do struggle with a lot, is just understanding how to play defense in this team-based setting at times, understanding really what the defensive assignments are, how to communicate, how to play good team defense. It can be something that freshmen struggle with. I haven't seen that from Derek Queen at all. Julian Reese, we know he's a proven, pretty good defender in the Big Ten. He's gotten into foul troubles at times, but Julian Reese is a good defender. So I am not seeing really that this is an issue where this team isn't switchable enough, or the fact that they're playing these 2 bigs is causing them problems against more athletic teams. What I'm kind of been seeing, what I saw in this Oregon game was, look, you got to give Oregon a little bit of credit here, because they had a guard in this game in Jackson Shilstad, who came into this game shooting an absolutely horrific percentage from beyond the arc. I can't remember offhand, but it was certainly below 30. I can't remember exactly what the number was, but he was below 30. He drilled 5 threes in this game. And some of them were hard threes. Some of them were well-defended threes. So you've got to give Oregon a little bit of credit there. But then also when you look at it, it just felt like there were some things that were either communication-based, maybe just mental lapses, things that feel correctable. Now, that's only comforting if they can go and figure it out. Because in these games against good teams, and Marquette, very good team. Purdue, good team. Oregon, good team. Maryland has struggled defensively because they haven't been able to force turnovers. And when they haven't forced turnovers, they haven't been able to get the stops necessary. So that's the second thing for me when it comes to the bad. And then as we finish off here with the ugly, it was the lack of composure down the stretch for me. Because this was a game Maryland had an opportunity to win down the stretch. Maryland had a lead late in the second half. The Terps were tied in this game with 4:34 to go. And it felt to me like there was just a complete lack of composure down the stretch. With 2.5 minutes to go, the game was tied. There was a mistake defensively. I think it was a mistake. And I mean, I'll just kind of lay out the play for you. Nate Biddle, Oregon's big man, gets the ball. Jacoby Gillespie doubles down on him in the post, leaving Bartholomew, one of their better shooters, Oregon's better shooters, wide open for a three, which gives Oregon a 3-point lead. Then Gillespie comes down the court. He takes what I thought was an ill-advised three. I think there was still something like 16 seconds left on the shot clock. It felt like Maryland could have gotten a better look in that scenario. And then on the next possession, everybody ball watches and they give up an open three that misses and they give up an offensive rebound. Then Jacoby Gillespie misses a free throw. And then finally, at the end of that game, very end of that game, Derek Queen in a 4-point game calls a timeout when Maryland has no timeouts remaining. I felt like that was a lack of composure down the stretch. And I'm not trying to pick on anybody here, certainly, because Jacoby Gillespie, I'm a huge fan of his. I think he's been a great addition to this team. I think if this team is going to be successful the rest of the season, if this team can make a run in the tournament, it will be in large part because of Jacoby Gillespie. But it felt like he had some mental mistakes. The team showed a lack of composure down the stretch in this game. And that was the ugly to me. Because this is now the third time where Maryland has had a chance to beat a really good team in a close game. They've been well positioned to beat a really good team in the close game, and they haven't been able to do the little things to get it done. I mean, I just named like 4 things there in that last 2.5 minutes where you just look at it and you say, a very good team, if you want to win a close game against a good team, you have to do those things. You have to do the basics. You have to take good shots. You have to communicate well on defense. You can't be ball watching. You have to rebound. You have to make free throws, and you have to know the game situations. And it didn't feel like down the stretch in that game that happened. And that's something that is concerning because, again, this is now the third time this season that Maryland has been well positioned in a close game against a good team and hasn't been able to do the little things to get it done. And you look at kind of all 3 of those games. You start off with Marquette, right? Marquette, very early in the season, you don't really know much about this Maryland team. You don't know what you're getting. They're 3-0. They've beaten Manhattan, Mount St. Mary's, and Florida A&M. They have a huge game on a Friday night against a Marquette team that's been very good under Shaka Smart, that has one of the best players in the country in Cam Jones. And they play really well in that game. They fight back at the very end. They have a chance to win that game, but you don't get it done. And you leave that game, or at least I did, feeling like, okay, this team has a lot of promise. I think this is going to be a fun season. Then they roll off a bunch of wins, including an ugly one against Villanova, but one that is very good and is a quad 1 win right now. They thrash Ohio State at home, and they go on the road to Purdue. And again, well positioned to win that game, can't quite get it done, but you look at it and you say, Purdue is an experienced team, a team that went to the Final Four last year. Braden Smith is one of the best guards in this league, if not the country. Trey Kaufman-Renn, to that point, had been playing like one of the best players in the country, a more experienced big than a Derek Queen, and he was really good offensively in that game against the Terps, putting up 21 points in the effort. And you look at that and you just kind of say, okay, Purdue's a team that has been the class of the Big Ten for years. They know what it takes to win games like that. Mackey's a really, really tough place to play, as tough as it gets in the Big Ten. And you still feel like there's promise here, especially after they go out and they just beat up on a Syracuse team in Brooklyn that really didn't look like they wanted to be there. And you start to see these computer numbers skyrocket. But then you get to game number 3. And of course, in context, they lose to Washington, and that matters because that starts to have a little more doubt creep in for people. And you have game number 3 against a really good team. And I would say Marquette, Purdue, and Oregon are pretty clearly the 3 best teams Maryland's faced this year. And now for the 3rd time, you get in this situation where you're well positioned. And you can't get the job done. And you see mental mistakes down the stretch. You see kind of like a lack of composure. And it feels like for a lot of the fan base, or at least a portion of the fan base, what looked like promise against Marquette, what looked like promise against Purdue, is now concern leaving Oregon. Because it's starting to look like a trend. It's starting to look like a trend that Maryland has trouble winning close games, just winning close games, period, because the Washington game, a close game, not against a good team. They couldn't get that one, couldn't pull that one out, but certainly winning close games against good teams. What was once promise starts to look concerning, starts to look like a trend. And I think that's where a lot of Maryland fans sit today as they think about this weekend, as they think about this Terps team, and look at what they have coming up down the stretch run here over the next 2 months of the season. So a disappointing West Coast trip for the Terps, but I don't think by any means this season is lost. Now, yes, the Big Ten regular season championship, that's probably out the window. Since the Big Ten went to 20 games in 2019, a 20-game schedule in 2019, the most losses a conference champion has had is 6 losses, and that's only happened once. That happened in the 2020 season. Of course, Maryland was one of those teams that was tied at the top of the standings. It was a 3-way tie between Michigan State, Maryland, and Wisconsin at 14-6. But typically, you are going to need something like a 15-5, 16-4, Purdue last year 17-3 record to win this league. And I just don't think in a league that has this many teams with unbalanced schedules that you are going to have a conference champion with 6 losses. Somebody is going to find a way to separate themselves a little bit and go 15-5 in this league. So Maryland's sitting at 1-3 in the league. That would mean Maryland could only lose 2 more times. That would mean in their remaining 16 games, Maryland needs to go 14-2. As positive as I still am about this team, I don't think that's feasible. So, okay, the regular season Big Ten crown is probably out the window. That's okay. That was always probably going to be a little bit of a long shot. I think Illinois right now is a team that I think could definitely take that down. Really like the way they're playing. How could you not after that thrashing of Oregon? But that's out the window. There's still a lot to play for this season. Maryland's still a team at this moment, and I've heard a lot of talk the past day about, okay, Maryland could end up on the wrong side of the bubble. Maryland's still a team with a net ranking of number 23. The Terps are 2-3 in quad 1 games. The loss to Washington, as disappointing as it was, still a quad 2 loss. So they don't have a single bad loss on the season, and 3 of their 4 losses are quad 1 losses. And they have a huge game against UCLA coming up on Friday night. And Maryland will need the kind of home crowd that they sometimes have at the Xfinity Center. Maryland will need that kind of vintage home crowd that can really carry them through, because it's been a struggle for Maryland on the road in Big Ten play under Kevin Willard. It seems pretty clear that this year is going to be no different. And look, I shouldn't say just under Kevin Willard, because last year, everybody in the Big Ten struggled to win on the road. In fact, last season, I want to make sure I get the exact number here. In Big Ten conference games, the home team won 68.3% of games. That was second only behind Conference USA as far as home team win percentage. So it's been really tough to win in the Big Ten. It's not an excuse, it's just a fact. It's been hard to win in the Big Ten. Maryland can't go 0-10 on the road in the Big Ten. I don't expect them to. But it's a challenge to win on the road. So having said that, Maryland needs to hold serve. Maryland needs to hold serve at home. Maryland needs to play as well as they have at home like they did in 2023. 2023, they had a great home court advantage, only lost one home game all season, which was a game, ironically, a non-conference game at the time, to UCLA. And that's who will come into town on Friday night. And this is a huge game for the Terps. Now, you'll hear people call it a must-win. I fundamentally just do not believe any game on January 10th, with still 15 conference games to go after this, can be called a must-win. Because to be called a must-win, it really has to be do or die. But would be a really, really, really nice to win game. It's a game that you'd really like to win. It's a game that you, for your own confidence as a team, for excitement around the fan base, for belief from the fan base, you would really want to win. Because I do think it's important in that regard that if Maryland wins this game, it's something that can sustain a good home court advantage the rest of the season, which is something they are very much going to need because of how hard it is to win on the road in this conference. So as disappointing as that road trip was, I think Maryland is still well positioned. I still believe that this is a Maryland team that's as well equipped as any Maryland team to make a real run in the NCAA tournament. And by that, I mean to the Sweet 16 and beyond, since the 2020 team and the tournament that never happened. I have talked about this before. I am not the biggest believer that team was going to make any sort of deep run because of the way they finished down the stretch. But you look at the pieces on that team, you look at what they had, you look at how they were able to go on the road and beat Michigan State, and you can see with Anthony Cowan, with Jalen Smith, with Aaron Wiggins, that was a team that had pieces that could make a run. I think this team is the most well-equipped since that one to make a real run to a Sweet 16 and beyond because of all the pieces. There are things they have to figure out, and I just talked about them ad nauseum. They need to figure out how to do the little things down the stretch. They need to figure out how to keep their composure. They need to figure out how to either just consistently create turnovers against really good teams or to find a way to get stops when they're not creating turnovers. But I am far from panic mode with this team at this moment. I'm still very hopeful about this team. Now, if they start to lose home games in conference, that's when I might get a little bit more worried. But as of this moment, I don't have any reason to believe that this team won't be an NCAA tournament team. I still believe they will, and I still believe they have an outstanding chance to make a run in the NCAA tournament. But this UCLA game is a big one. You don't want to lose 3 in a row. You don't want to fall to 1-4 in conference. You want to build these quality wins when you have the chance. And for the confidence of the team, you want them to get a win in a close game against a good team because sometimes that's all it takes to say, hey, we can do this. See, we just did it. It just takes one to know that you can do it. And as nice as it is to drill Ohio State by 24, game that really felt more like a 40-point win, as nice as it is to drill Syracuse by 27, you want to see them get a close win. And the Villanova game was a close win. And that's a Villanova team that's played a lot better since then. They got off to a rough start to the season, but they have played a lot better since then. They got a big win against Cincinnati. They beat Seton Hall, Butler. They're 3-1 in conference. That's a Villanova team that isn't looking like it's so certain. There was a time going into that Maryland game where everybody was kind of assuming Kyle Neptune might be done at Villanova at the end of this season. That doesn't look so certain at the moment. So they have that one, but you got to get another one. You got to get it in conference play because these things build on one another. Confidence leads to more confidence. Wins leads to more wins. And they got to figure out a way how to do those little things down the stretch to get those wins. But no doubt, It is a big game coming up against UCLA on Friday night. I'm really excited for it. I hope it's going to be a good home crowd. It's at the same time as the college football playoff, Ohio State, Texas. And actually, that leads me to a little aside here. Something I really kind of wanted to mention earlier in the show, but I'll save it till now. I'll do it right now. This weekend, with Maryland playing conference games at Washington and Oregon, it felt as weird to me as anything we have seen in all of conference realignment. We've seen some weird stuff. We have seen some really weird stuff. On the football side, we just saw BYU and Colorado, two conference opponents, play in a bowl game. That's weird. We've seen Florida State and Cal play a conference game in football. That's weird. Look, you're a Maryland fan. You're listening to this. You're a Terps fan. I'm a Terps fan. I grew up loving Maryland. I went to Maryland. I love the Terps. I love the school. I grew up on the ACC. And to see Maryland play conference games against Nebraska, Wisconsin, Michigan, Penn State, Ohio State, that's been weird. But nothing has been weirder to me than Maryland playing a 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time tip against Washington on a Thursday night. That was bizarre. I turned that on. It did not feel right. And then for Maryland to play Oregon at 4 p.m. on a Sunday on Peacock on the final weekend of the NFL season. Who is that good for? Who is that good for? Who wants that? Because to start a game 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time against a team that Maryland has no tradition with, no history with, I'm not sure that anybody was excited about that game. I'm not sure that anybody was excited about staying up till past 11 p.m. on January 2nd. Most people had probably had a long week, a long holiday week. They were working the next day. I don't know anybody that was excited about that. I don't know anybody that was fired up that I can't wait for this Maryland-Washington game tonight. It wasn't good for fans. And then you get to this Oregon game on a Sunday afternoon, and it's a huge game, right? Oregon was the number 9 team in the country. I've talked about it. Oregon beat Alabama this year. Oregon is a really good basketball team. That's a huge game for Maryland. It's a huge game for Oregon. And we all know the NFL is king throughout this entire country, but really in this area. In Baltimore, in D.C., the NFL is king. And of course, the Ravens played on Saturday. They clinched the AFC North on Saturday, but the Commanders are playing on Sunday for playoff seeding. And my family, that is a Maryland family through and through and through. They are the ones that instilled this love of Maryland in me. They're the reason that I loved Maryland basketball growing up. They're the reason I went to Maryland. My family, that is a Maryland family, through and through and through, did not exchange a single text about this game. There's about 15 texts that went through that group chat about the Commanders, but not a single text about this Maryland basketball game. And I just wonder, I have to ask the Big Ten. I have to ask, who is this good for? Why do that? And I know the answer to it. I know the answer. I know the answer is that NBC gave the Big Ten a bunch of money for TV rights, and this is how it's going to go. And honestly, to be perfectly honest with you, I actually really liked the presentation on Peacock. I thought it was really good. My bigger problem is, how is this growing awareness of the sport? How is this something that is good for the fans? It's certainly not good for the players to be flying all the way across the country and all the way back. That's no doubt about it. That's not even a debate. But how is this good for the fans? How does this create excitement about your product when you are playing these games in the middle of week 18 of an NFL Sunday on a streaming service? It'd be one thing if it was on NBC leading into Sunday Night Football, right? Ahead of Vikings-Lions. That's Big Ten country right there. That would be one thing. But on a streamer at 4 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon, while everybody is watching the NFL, how does that create excitement around college basketball? And I have to give kudos to the SEC because I love what the SEC did. They did not start conference play at all until after football season. Well, it's not over, but, after New Year's, we got 3 college football games left, got 2 semifinals and a national championship game, but they played 8 conference games this past Saturday. All 16 SEC teams were in action. They all played on Saturday. And throughout the season, SEC fans know they play Saturdays, they play Tuesdays, they play Wednesdays for the most part. And I think that's a big deal. It makes it feel more like football. It's nice when you know that Saturdays are the day I watch college basketball. I watch SEC basketball on Saturdays. That's a really nice thing. I will always say, I will hold strong on this forever, that a huge part of the reason for the success of football, among with many other things, is the fact that it's once a week and everybody knows when to watch it. If you're a college football fan, on Saturdays, you watch college football. If you're an NFL fan, on Sundays, you watch the NFL. For the SEC to say, hey, we're going to play our games on Saturdays, just like football, and then we'll do a midweek game Tuesdays and Wednesdays, I think just creates such a better flow within a season and makes it feel like more of an event. And Maryland, Washington was bizarre for the fact that it started late at night on a weeknight in a weird location that Maryland doesn't ever really play in. Maryland, Oregon was weird for the fact that that should have been a big game. Oregon is a good team. Maryland has been very good this year, but it felt like there was no buzz or excitement or anything around it because it was on a Sunday afternoon in the final week of the NFL season on a streaming service. So that's my rant. That's my rant on it. I'm just disappointed in it because it doesn't feel like it's benefiting, certainly not players, and definitely not the fans either. So, look, I love college sports more than anything. I left a pretty successful career to try to make a career talking about college sports, creating college sports content. So don't get me wrong. Don't get it confused. I love college sports outside of my family, my friends, my dog. I love college sports more than anything. If you told me, hey, what do you want to do this weekend? It would be go to a big college basketball game, go to a big college football game. I love college sports. I love the atmosphere around college sports. I love sitting in the stands in a big time environment for a big time game and soaking it all in. It's my absolute favorite thing in the world. That doesn't mean there isn't times that we can criticize, or not even criticize, just ask questions, make suggestions about how we can improve this product, how we can improve this sport, how we can create more visibility for a sport that I actually think is a good product right now in college basketball. I've talked about it a ton on the other show that I do, Tailgate Till May, about the marketing of college basketball, because I think it's been a great product the past couple of seasons. I just think it hasn't been marketed in the right way. And that's kind of what feels like happened to me on Sunday afternoon here with Maryland and Oregon being shoved in the corner, where even people who really care about Maryland basketball, it wasn't at the front of their consciousness. They weren't talking about it because of the day, the time, the place, etc. So get off my soapbox there. Maryland has a big game on Friday against UCLA, and I will be back to preview it all. I can't wait to do it. And until next time, this has been the Route 1 Rundown.